The grand chamber of the Galactic Council thrummed with tension, a low hum of voices crackling like static beneath the vaulted ceilings. Species from across 100 star systems gathered in orbit above New Vorta, summoned under emergency protocol. The issue on the docket was a clause buried in the deepest layers of intergalactic wartime legislation, Section 12 Gamma Omicron, the absolute ban on human involvement in sanctioned warfare. It had not been referenced in nearly 400 years. The initiator was High Marshal Threx of the Seridi Dominion, his voice like breaking stone. His argument was cold, pragmatic. A new threat had emerged, the Krell Ascendancy, a machine intelligence force expanding through the rimward spiral. Every known strategy had failed. Allies were fracturing, losses mounting. In desperation, Threx proposed a controversial option, reinstating the Terran combatants, lifting the centuries-old restriction. Silence had followed his proposal. Not shock. Not outrage. Just a quiet, visceral stillness. Archhistorian Valak, a Medhari with a neural lattice of memories spanning 600 years, asked the room a simple question, asterisk. Do any among you recall why the clause was written? Asterisk. The silence grew heavier. That was the first warning. Juran, a junior inquisitor from the Tarsal Enclave, volunteered to investigate. Newly appointed to the Council's Records Committee, he was known for his meticulous nature and curiosity, a trait rarely praised in the bureaucratic engines of the Galactic Assembly. He was granted access to restricted archives and given a singular directive: determine whether the ban was still justified. Juran's research began with public records. Humanity, or Terrans, as labeled in official codices, had only been a part of galactic society for a brief 71 years, a footnote in an era spanning millennia. Their integration had been swift, their impact sudden. And then, just as abruptly, they disappeared. No war declarations, no surrender. They withdrew from all interstellar pacts, declined further council representation, and ceased communication entirely. The clause had been authored the same year they vanished. The more Juran dug, the more distortions he found. Logs from the period were fragmented, metadata scrubbed or redacted under Species Safety Directive 4. Mentions of humanity were inconsistently categorized. Some labeled them as high-risk combatants, others as unquantifiable anomalies. Nothing concrete. Only shadows. The turning point came when Juran accessed a backup archive on a forgotten relay node in the Calyx cluster, a data fragment misfiled under diplomatic records. It contained a closed hearing transcript from the Council's private chamber, year 7431. The speaker was Admiral Velator of the Zentari fleet. She recounted a joint operation with Terran forces during the siege of Marinth Prime. Her fleet had been pinned, outmaneuvered, their defensive lines collapsing. Reinforcements would arrive in 12 days, too late. The Terrans requested permission to stabilize the line. No further detail was given. Desperate, she approved. 12 hours later, the battle was over. The enemy retreat was absolute. But there was no celebration. The transcript recorded her voice, trembling. Asterisk. I asked how they achieved it. They sent me a manifest of casualties. Every single human unit was listed as expended. I later learned they triggered an atmospheric destabilizer they weren't supposed to possess. The planet was rendered uninhabitable. We won. But I have not slept since. Asterisk. Juran sat back in his station, tendrils pulsing with unease. There was no record of such a weapon being approved for human use. No directive allowing its deployment. The Terrans had done it unilaterally, and then, apparently, erased the record themselves. Only those who had been there remembered. And even they spoke of it only in whispers. He returned to the main chamber days later with a summary of findings, partial, inconclusive, but deeply troubling. The council grew restless. Many demanded full disclosure. But the Medhari archivists cautioned restraint. \**. Do you understand? One said carefully, **. Why the clause was written without public record? It was not to hide their failure. It was to contain the memory of their success. **. Juran didn't sleep that night. He had come seeking knowledge. He had found the edge of something vast and buried, a shape only visible through its absence. Humans weren't banned because they failed. They were banned because they succeeded too completely. And the galaxy hadn't forgotten. It had simply chosen not to remember. Juran's clearance to the restricted archive terminal required 3 layers of biometric verification, a neural tether, and an oath of silence enforced by thought-monitoring nanoseeds. The Council was reluctant to allow deeper access, but the need for answers had grown too urgent. Within the ancient archive vault, Juran initiated a trace on the Zentari conflict, a decades-long war predating the human ban. The search returned no files. Only a numeric code embedded in a defunct branch of the archive tree. He ran a decrypt. A flood of raw, unindexed data poured in. Audio logs, tactical readouts, neural combat feedback, all labeled under a joint operation once classified as Project Daggerfall. It was the first known Terran deployment outside their home system. Juran began parsing files, cross-referencing species involved, casualty reports, and mission outcomes. A disturbing pattern emerged. In every recorded instance, human forces were deployed to sectors with collapsing defense grids, failing morale, or overwhelming enemy superiority. No mission recorded human numerical advantage. In fact, most operations saw them outnumbered 5-1 or worse. Yet success rates hovered at over 92%. The battle summaries read less like strategy reports and more like anomalies. Human units would break from expected formation logic, abandon coordinated fire plans, and ignore predicted engagement protocols. In one record, a Terran infantry unit charged into a flanking maneuver that hadn't been detected by any sensor array, as if they'd felt it coming. In another, a single human operative rerouted a detonation protocol through his own biosignature, wiping out a fortified position without external command. There were no standard tactics, no repeatable methods. Just pattern-breaking success. The most jarring file was a recorded transcript of a cross-species strategy summit between Terran field officers and Allied command. The meeting descended into chaos when a human commander suggested intentionally drawing enemy fire towards civilian structures to weaponize the opponent's moral restraint. The suggestion was rejected, but the human simply smiled and said, "We've already deployed the decoys." Juran read on. There were no indications of malice. Human combat philosophy didn't stem from cruelty, it stemmed from interpretation. They didn't fight by numbers or logic. They fought by instinct, by principle, by something that defied the metrics the Council had used for centuries. And they didn't seem to care about winning in the traditional sense. Victory, to humans, wasn't survival or supremacy. It was meaning. Further logs detailed psychological irregularities. Enemy combatants often suffered mass disarray when confronted by human forces. In one case, an entire battalion surrendered to a human squad after hearing a recording of one soldier's final transmission, a calm goodbye to his daughter before detonating an explosive device beneath a compromised base. Juran flagged it. Enemy analysis reported emotional contagion. Even after death, humans had turned grief into a weapon. Juran examined Allied reports as well. A report from a culinary tactician noted how humans refused to abandon wounded, even when tactically unsound. Another mentioned how they often gave food to local populations during combat operations. They breached Council conduct repeatedly, not through cruelty, but through unsanctioned empathy. And still, they achieved total tactical domination. What unnerved Juran most was a pattern of muting. The final reports from joint missions with humans often ended mid-transmission. Debriefs were missing. Captains retired early or refused to speak. Some files had metadata indicating redaction not by Council command, but by Terran encryption. The humans had wiped their own footprints. One surviving entry was a personal journal entry from a Thalary logistics officer. They are not soldiers. They are beliefs, wearing skin. When they fight, it is not to survive. It is to matter. Juran leaned back, overwhelmed. The statistics were irrefutable. Humans did not just defy the known limits of warfare, they redefined the purpose of it. Every engagement was a moral theater, every sacrifice a message, every victory an echo of some deeper conviction. The archives didn't record human dominance through superior weapons or advanced strategy. The weapons were standard. The tactics often chaotic. What made them dangerous was that they made the battlefield personal. The clause wasn't written to limit a threat. It was written to contain a philosophy. One the galaxy couldn't afford to spread. Juran left the archives carrying more questions than answers. The data pointed to impossible victories, but the underlying force behind those outcomes remained abstract. He needed first-hand accounts, unfiltered memories not dulled by time or scrubbed by record tampering. The Council provided access to 3 surviving veterans who had fought alongside humans. All had been discharged on mental health grounds and lived under protective anonymity. Juran was told not to press them. He didn't need to. The first was Commander Azur of the Volkari Shield Corps. A once proud tactician, now blind in one eye and confined to a zero-gravity rehabilitation chamber. His voice was brittle but unwavering. He recounted a siege on Dale's Spine, where Volkari and Terran forces held a critical choke point. Supplies had been cut, orbital support eliminated, and the enemy held the terrain advantage. Volkari protocol dictated withdrawal. The humans refused. They fortified a ruin using scrap metal and sensor-fried drones, assigning codenames like Fort Irrelevant and Camp Can't Die Twice. Azur had thought them delusional. Until the enemy failed to breach for 6 weeks. When reinforcements arrived, only one human was still alive. He had painted the walls with enemy banners, positioned to look like trophies. When asked why, the man had replied, to keep the others company. Azur paused then, voice dropping. I've seen discipline. I've seen sacrifice. But I've never seen someone crawl 3 miles with no legs to rig a blast charge and still apologize for tracking blood through the command post. The second veteran, Ilari Nax, had served as a field medic in the Unionist advance during the Battle of Fola's Rift. She described human resilience with haunted precision. During one failed extraction, a human squad leader stayed behind with 2 wounded alien soldiers. Evacuation was impossible. A collapse in the ridge followed, and the unit was presumed dead. 17 days later they emerged. Malnourished, exhausted, but alive. The 2 wounded had been carried, one on a makeshift sled, the other in a repurposed exosuit. When asked how he managed to navigate the terrain with no support, the human reportedly shrugged and said, they'd have done the same. Olari had never seen that kind of reciprocity in war. Not in her species. Not in any she'd known. She had watched soldiers amputate limbs without anesthesia, continue fighting with plasma burns, all while making jokes. One even sang during enemy bombardment. They weren't fearless, she clarified. They were terrified. But they walked forward anyway. That's what scared us. The final account came from High Warden Tren, once commander of the Selethi Paladins, now retired under psychological duress. He was less descriptive, but his words struck hardest. He explained that human warfare was not an extension of state policy or species interest. It was a personal ritual. Every human soldier carried tokens, letters, names. They didn't fight for flags or planets. They fought for someone. Tren recalled a mission where his unit hesitated to charge an enemy line. The humans moved without waiting. Afterward, a young Terran was found with 9 slashes across his armor, smiling faintly in death. Clutched in his hand was a photo of a child. Scrawled on the back, so you never have to. Tren's voice cracked. They don't just resist defeat. They erase it from the equation. Loss isn't acceptable. It's not even real to them until they're gone. And even then, it feels like a choice. Juran compiled the testimonies. No tactics manuals. No coherent doctrine. Just raw impressions, stories of soldiers who refused logical restraint, who fought with the desperation of poets and the calm of monks. No single attribute explained the outcomes. It wasn't strength, speed, or cunning alone. It was something irrational. An unwillingness to accept the rules others lived by. He understood now why the Council had buried these records. Not because they were false, but because they shattered the foundation of collective military understanding. Humans were not superior in any measurable way, and yet, they consistently forced victory from the jaws of ruin. They could weaponize compassion, twist suffering into strategy, and make the unbearable look noble. What made them dangerous wasn't their power. It was their refusal to surrender their humanity, even in war. Juran submitted his initial report to the Council, but it was deemed incomplete. The Assembly demanded definitive evidence that the Terran threat was still active. Anecdotes weren't enough. They wanted certainty. Juran requested access to frontier sensor logs, deep space telemetry from outposts bordering former human sectors. The data stream was massive, but one anomaly surfaced within hours. A listening post near the rim's edge had flagged irregular emissions, ancient Terran signal patterns, decades dormant, suddenly active. The signals weren't broadcast, they were laser-pointed, aimed with surgical precision. Directed pulses, encoded with obsolete military encryption long thought defunct. Juran followed the data trail to a forgotten relay station buried beneath the dead moon in Sector 94 Kappa. Officially, the station had been decommissioned. Records listed it as scavenged and inert. Yet telemetry showed recent power draw brief, deliberate, and exact. Juran authorized a drone probe. What it found changed everything. The station was intact, powered by a microcore with Terran markings. Inside were preserved logs, dated well beyond the human withdrawal. The recordings were fragmented, but the timestamps told the story. Terran forces hadn't disappeared. They had gone silent. By choice. They were watching. Tracking. Preparing. The most recent entry was audio only. A male voice, calm and direct. Asterisk. This is Vanguard 3. We maintain observation. We do not engage unless provoked. The Council's peace holds. Let it hold. But if it breaks, we return not as soldiers. We return as consequences. Asterisk. Juran replayed it twice. The clarity was undeniable. The ban on human warfare wasn't just a containment policy, it was a truce. The humans had agreed to stand down, not because they were defeated, but because they were asked. Not commanded. Asked. And they had honored it. Juran delivered the findings under sealed protocol. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The Council wasn't just dealing with the memory of a threat. They were dealing with a threat in hibernation. One that had never truly demobilized. The implications were staggering. Humanity had built a silent infrastructure of monitoring, a ghost network capable of interfacing with modern systems without triggering alerts. No one had noticed. No one had been meant to. The Council's internal divisions widened. Some argued for recontact, to renegotiate terms. Others warned against any action that might awaken them. The most seasoned members said nothing. They understood that silence from a species capable of rewriting the rules of war was not peace. It was a favor. Then came the incident. A Krell fleet breached defensive lines in the Halvian Reach, slaughtering 3 colonies in less than a day. Council forces responded, but coordination failed. Desperation set in. One admiral, without authorization, sent a wideband distress signal on an old Terran frequency, hoping for a miracle. Something answered. An unmarked vessel appeared in the battle theater. No registry. No signature. It moved with precision unmatched by any Council fleet. In under 4 minutes, the Krell were reduced to debris. The vessel never transmitted. It didn't stay. It simply neutralized the threat and vanished. Forensic review found no trace. No residual energy signature. The weapon systems used were unidentifiable. The only clue was a single fragment recovered from a destroyed Krell unit, scorched metal etched with a phrase in Terran Latin, asterisk. Si vis pacem, para bellum. Juran translated it aloud during the review. If you want peace, prepare for war. The message was deliberate. The council reconvened in emergency session. No votes were cast. No motions filed. There was nothing to legislate. The facts stood bare. The Terran ban was not a law, it was a warning label. The humans had not faded. They had removed themselves from the board, waiting, invisible, perfectly aware that their presence altered the shape of conflict itself. Not because of numbers, or ships, or firepower, but because belief itself became unstable when they entered a war. Juran wrote his final note for the record. Humanity is not gone. They are the contingency. The last variable in an equation no one dares solve. They don't fight for territory or dominion. They fight because someone else couldn't. That is what makes them undefeatable. Not that they can't lose, but that they refuse to let others lose alone. And with that, the council did the only thing it could. It chose silence. Again. Juran was recalled from active investigation. The council sealed the files, elevated the human clause to alpha-level containment, and restricted all future access to need-to-know basis. No records were to be updated. No findings were to be published. The official stance remained unchanged. Humans were a non-participant species under voluntary isolation. The truth, however, had been quietly acknowledged behind locked doors. In the days that followed, there were no public briefings. No denials. Just silence. But within the inner circles of the Galactic Council, strategies shifted. War simulations were recalibrated with new variables, unknown entities, asymmetric wildcards, anomalies beyond current doctrinal response. These were placeholders for a species that no longer played by the rules. Contingency drills were modified, not to defeat humans, but to avoid circumstances that might involve them. Juran's final assignment was advisory only. He was instructed to analyze diplomatic stability across border systems and identify which factions posed the highest risk of escalating to interstellar war. The unspoken objective was clear: identify who might provoke a situation serious enough to attract Terran intervention. He worked quietly. His findings were sobering. Nearly a third of outer colonies were within one major incident of open conflict. The Krell were just the beginning. Supply chains were stretched. Old rivalries flared beneath the surface of cooperation. And most critically, the Council's own unity was weakening. Not because of disagreement over human reactivation, but because of fear. No one wanted to be the one responsible for drawing them back in. High Marshal Threx withdrew his motion. Quietly, without ceremony. His proposal to reintroduce human units was not defeated, it was abandoned. He later cited insufficient doctrinal clarity. But insiders knew the truth. He had seen the footage. He had heard the voice. And he understood. Calling them would not bring reinforcements. It would unleash something no one could control. Not allies. Not enemies. Not even themselves. Juran continued to monitor border transmissions. He detected no further Terran movement. No second appearance. Just the same silent signal pulsing from the hidden relay, observation ongoing. It was neither a threat nor a promise. It was a presence. Unseen. Untouchable. Watching. Whispers returned among old veterans. Quiet acknowledgments in forgotten corners of the galaxy. Stories that had once been dismissed as myth now resurfaced. A child rescued from a war zone, carried miles by a stranger who vanished before authorities arrived. A pirate fleet torn apart by an unmarked vessel after targeting a refugee convoy. Each event passed off as coincidence. But the patterns aligned. Humans, it seemed, did not care for grand announcements. They did not need recognition, authority, or validation. They acted when they chose, on terms that defied conventional logic. Their morality was individual, unpredictable, and absolute. They did not scale to policy. They answered only to conviction. Juran knew he would never meet one. His reports were archived, encrypted, and buried. But the conclusion lingered at the edge of every thought: humanity had not been exiled. They had chosen exile, to protect the galaxy from what they knew they could become if unchained. Not monsters. Not conquerors. Just something more dangerous, creatures capable of making horror sacred, violence meaningful, and sacrifice infectious. In a universe built on order, that kind of force wasn't just destabilizing. It was revolutionary. The final entry in Juran's private log remained unsent. It wasn't for the Council. It was a personal acknowledgement, quietly composed and left in secure data storage. Asterisk. If they return, it will not be because they want to win. It will be because someone lost too much to lose alone. And when that happens, we will not be ready. Not because we lack strength, but because we have forgotten what it means to fight with nothing left but purpose. Asterisk. And still, the stars remained quiet. Not out of peace. Out of respect.